Yeah.
We've got breaking news right now out of Russia, and this is potentially very big. State media is reporting that mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin's name was on a list of passengers of a plane that crashed. 10 people, they report, are dead. I want to bring in former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Let me just read to you a little more that's been reported. It's not much more than I said, but according to Russia's Federal Air Transport Agency, an investigation of the Embraer plane crash that happened in the Tver region, I'm not certain I'm saying that right, it's TVER, this evening was initiated. And again, a man with Prigozhin's name was among the passengers. They did not elaborate further. Let me get your initial reaction here, Ambassador.
Pretty shocking. It doesn't sound like it was just a plane crash. It sounds like his plane was shot down. That's what I'm reading on Russian reporting. Now, they're going to allege it was an accident, I'm sure, but it seems very strange that Mr. Prigozhin, everybody knows his plane, he travels around, that would be an accident. And I think what this might tell us is that the split between the conventional Russian armed forces and Prigozhin that we saw on full display a few months ago, they never saw eye to eye again. They've been debating, and now they took their action against Prigozhin. And I suspect it won't be the end of this. There'll be more tensions between those that support Wagner, including, by the way, some soldiers in the Russian conventional forces and the leadership at the top.
All right, if you can stand by, Ambassador, I also want to bring in Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel, who is joining us by phone. Richard, what do you know, or what context can you put to this?
Well, at this stage, we really only know what the Russian media are reporting, but they are all reporting it consistently, that there has been a plane crash. That's how they are describing it, just as you were describing it, that an Embraer jet was traveling from Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport to St. Petersburg and crashed less than 30 minutes after takeoff, according to the TASS news agency. And it does seem very suspicious. Many of us who followed Prigozhin closely thought that this would eventually be his fate, that he rose up against Vladimir Putin, he embarrassed Vladimir Putin, he led an unthinkable, unheard of mutiny against the Kremlin. And then it ended very strangely. It ended with this vague deal in which he was supposed to go to Belarus, but then he was in Africa and his movements were somewhat vague. And the people that I've been speaking to believed that Putin was buying time, that Putin couldn't have just enacted his revenge right away, that he needed to understand who was involved in the mutiny. And there are several senior Russian generals who've been implicated in that mutiny who have gone missing. So that he needed to understand who else was involved or may have been involved. And he also needed to have a better understanding of Prigozhin's business network, particularly his network in Africa, where in the Central African Republic and many other countries in the Sahel, he has a valuable network providing security services, or I should say he had a valuable network providing security services in exchange for mineral rights, in exchange for gold and diamond concessions. So we all were expecting something like this, and it's not surprising that the Russians are describing it as an accident, but I don't think very many people in Moscow, in Russia, will be interpreting this as a simple accident, that his plane, a private plane, was flying over Russian airspace and then suddenly crashes before takeoff, before landing.
Ambassador, I want to point out that we at NBC, as both of you have pointed out, we are not independently confirming this. This is coming from Russian news reports. Right. But the fact, Ambassador, that this is on TASS, what does that tell you? Is this a direct message from Vladimir Putin? And are you one of the people who, as we just heard from Richard, was expecting this? We didn't know when, didn't know how, but it was coming.
Well, a couple of things. First, we're assuming that Vladimir Putin ordered this. We should call it what it is, an assassination of Mr. Prigozhin. I should be careful. Even if it's on TASS, we need to figure out exactly what happened and listen to the final report of what happened, although it won't be conclusive because it's in Russia. But we should not jump to the conclusion yet that Putin was behind this. I'm not so sure about that. Maybe there are other forces that decided to take Prigozhin out. There were a lot of people disappointed that Putin negotiated with Prigozhin. And in other mysterious assassinations, what comes to mind, Boris Nemtsov's assassination back in 2015, he was a leading Russian opposition figure. It was very murky as to who finally made that decision. So I think that's what I'll be looking forward to finding out more about. Was Putin behind this, or was it elements within his Russian armed forces that actually didn't like the fact that he stood down when confronting Prigozhin months ago?
So what will tell you, or will we ever really know what happened here? What constitutes reliable sources coming out of Russia?
That's a really hard question. They're not reliable sources. There's lots of reporting. There will be other people that want to talk about it, but it will be very difficult to know the precise question that I was asking, right? Did Putin order this attack on Prigozhin or not? Just like with Nemtsov, there have been speculations for years, and ultimately, we don't exactly know whether he was behind it or not.
So as we're looking, Richard, for who, again, if it was indeed Prigozhin on that plane, and it's a recognizable plane, as the ambassador points out, and we're looking at the possibilities for, if this was not an accident, who might be behind it. You did a whole hour on the rise of the Wagner Group. Tell us a little bit more background that may be useful as we look at what's happening here.
So I think another way we might know if this was an accidental crash or if this was something more akin to an assassination attempt will come from videos. There are already some videos circulating that show fiery wreckage. Another video that seems to show a plane falling precipitously from the sky, not the kind of things that indicate, engine trouble or would indicate typical engine trouble. So I would think that U.S. intelligence agencies, foreign intelligence agencies, militaries that watch the sky may have been able to track something coming from the ground if that was what happened, or there could have been a bomb placed on board, or who knows. There is going to be a lot of reporting on this to come. But to answer your question, so Yevgeny Prigozhin was a mercenary leader, but he was much more than that. He was a close, and I'm using was, assuming that the Russian media reports are accurate at this stage, that he was very close to Vladimir Putin, was a close confidant with him as Putin rose to power. He was in the restaurant business, he was a petty criminal, and I spoke to many people who spent time with Prigozhin. We had some interactions with Prigozhin. He threatened to strangle me to death. So this was a volatile character who developed over time. He started out as a petty criminal, did about a decade of hard labor for assault and robbery in his early days, almost in his youth. And then as the Soviet Union collapsed, there was an opportunity for smart, aggressive, street-smart people both like Putin and like Prigozhin, and they rose to power, and they found each other because Prigozhin opened, very suspiciously, because he had the best real estate and best locations, he opened a chain of restaurants that became Putin and his inner circle's hideouts, and then the two of them kept rising and rising, and he was one time called Putin's chef. He was more like Putin's caterer. He catered to his meals, he served Putin food, so a great indication of how much trust. A lot of people I spoke to described the Russian state as a mafia state, and that he was one of Putin's operators. He was an earner. He had his own crime syndicate, but he was subservient to the boss, Vladimir Putin. But when he became outraged and he felt that he could challenge Putin because of the war in Ukraine, when Prigozhin became hyper-empowered and he turned his small mercenary force into almost a combat division of the Russian army, that he rose up, launched this mutiny, and then if this plays out, or according to what the Russians saying, he's now died in a fiery plane crash, then it would not be surprising, because He rose up. He was a close confidant. He was a member of the inner circle. But then he grew too powerful and then challenged the boss. And then, well, sometime down the line, a few months later, met his end. And many of Vladimir Putin's critics and challengers have been killed for far less than that.
So, Richard, as somebody who has been around him and understanding that the list of enemies of Prigozhin is very long, what was his security like?
That's a good question, because he depended on. So, yeah, he's such a complex character. So he begins as a typical mafioso. He goes to jail. He comes out. He opens these restaurants. Fortuitously for him, one of his customers is Vladimir Putin. Just as Vladimir Putin is rising through the ranks post-Soviet Union collapse and ultimately becomes president of Russia, putting Prigozhin in a very favored position. Over time, his mercenary army, the Wagner Group, grows and grows, with operations in Ukraine, operations in Syria, operations in the Central African Republic. And like in a mafia family, he enriched himself. Prigozhin's main priority was to help the boss, to honor the boss, to do what the boss needed, but also to enrich himself and his family and his friends. And he did that. And he did that over the years. So his security was largely his own group. It was the Wagner Group. He was worshipped in a way by the Wagner Group. He led this group with a strong cult of personality. The Wagner Group was known for extreme violence and brutality, including using sledgehammers to beat their opponents to death in a symbolic ritual to show how horrific they were and what the costs of betrayal could be. Prigozhin, according to the Russians, when they raided his house, they found sledgehammers, embossed sledgehammers that he would give out as kind of a state gift. So he was operating a state within the state of Wagner, and he depended on them for security. But after the mutiny, and I think that's why we're seeing this time lag, Putin and the military, and Ambassador Paul was talking about this deep resentment between Wagner and the military. The military has been absorbing Wagner, taking its pieces away from it, taking control of the organization one bit at a time. And that would also suggest that his power, his protection force, was also eroding as the Russian state was draining Wagner of its resources, of its enterprises.